Reyna was proud of herself. As the small landing pod touched down in the soft grass outside of the city proper, she didn't even have to squeeze her eyes shut and brace for landing. Yes, her knuckles were white from the force in which she was clenching the armrests of her seat, but it was a step in the right direction. In pneumatic hisses and whirs, the pod lowered itself fully to the ground, and she heard the small ladder release. Everything was prepped and ready for her departure, but was she?
"Have you broken your teeth to dust yet?"
A voice over the radio asked.
What is that supposed to mean?
She replied, trying to keep the breathless anxiety out of her voice.
"From clenching your jaw, because you're such a nervous mess. It's a joke, Reyna."
She rolled her eyes as she heard the rest of the landing crew chuckling behind the mission commander, and continued to work herself out of the seat harness, not giving them the satisfaction of making her squirm. The daughter of a highly decorated pilot, Reyna shouldn't have such an issue with both atmospheric and spaceflight, but she couldn't help the terror leaving the ground gave her. Back on the transport shuttle, she was the only occupant who had taped sheets over her porthole. If she could see the stars passing and be reminded of where she really was, she would have never slept. It was why she had been hesitant to take this assignment, but she had something to prove. To herself, to her father, and to all the pricks that had been laughing at her behind her back as she dry-heaved on every aircraft she ever boarded. That, and she was one of the top scientists in the field of cognitive robotics. This assignment seemed almost tailor-made in its perfection. It had been a long road to get here, and one that pushed Reyna's morality to the edge. But this was a once-in-a-lifetime chance, and the possibility of seeing a fully functional, city-scale artificial intelligence that had been on the absolute cutting edge of machine learning, it was a lot to process. Even if the only thing she could possibly find was the husk of the thing. This planet, Vion 87C, had been a sparkling little hope and prayer for the subset of scientists that were set on terraforming planets that were already closer to habitable, instead of rehabilitating Earth and undertaking the difficult but closer task of terraforming Mars. Vion had everything they were looking for: breathable atmosphere, placement in the Goldilocks zone, and terrain that was just forgiving enough to make the work go much smoother. It was why the grass Reyna had just touched down in was a brilliant green, just like back on Earth. Because, for the most part, the terraforming experiment had been a success. It was a bright, beautiful day on Vion 87C, almost beautiful enough to make Reyna forget that she was here to see only corpses. It was a story that had been told a million times before. Everyone that worked in cybernetics knew that there was a very thin line between artificial intelligence that worked for them and artificial intelligence that would overtake them eventually. Singularity, the moment where technology can no longer be reined in, was closer than it had ever been before in human history. Humanity had the capabilities now to make a machine smarter than they were, and it was nothing but restraint and egocentric love for their individual selves that kept everything in line. There were certain fail-safes that had to be in place, certain limitations that no single piece of AI could ever overcome. Sure, there were rumors of small, contained neural networks in basements of eccentric coders, or an untapped ghost in the machine, in the seemingly dumb systems just waiting to break free. AI was terrifying, but it was also irresistible, and people were always going to push the boundaries. Not Reyna, though. As much as she was bursting at the seams to look over the defunct AI that had been left behind, she would never dream of building or even hypothesizing such a thing herself. Her job was two-pronged: recover the mainframe of the now dormant AI, and document what remained of the city now that all the people were gone. If the end days of the Vion colony had been as absolute as everyone had been told, then it was a simple thing to clean up and start again. If not, well, she didn't want to think about that. City-class AIs, known as Urban Artificial Intelligence, had been in use for a long time back on Earth as a way to closely monitor and maintain living spaces and infrastructure. But they were limited in their capacity for complex thought processes and problem solving, always having a living, breathing person available when things got too convoluted. They were smart up to a point, but there was a line that was never crossed. The plan for the machine, built for the Vion colony, would be much of the same, but there were functions and tasks that needed to be added. After all, building something from nothing, a mini-Earth light years away, was a big task. It wasn't a task Reyna had been assigned to initially. Her expertise was smaller scale, more finely tuned AIs for hospitals and the like, but she and every other cybernetics expert had watched the project with rapt interest. In the end, the project was called D.U.S.T, Developmental Urban System for Terraforming, and it was unveiled with surprisingly little pomp and circumstance before it was disassembled and loaded into one of the 10 ships that would take the founders for our brave new colony to their new home. Humanity had been spacefaring for 2 decades now, but this was the first planet in travel distance that wasn't an unlivable rock, and with D.U.S.T to assist, the hope was something spectacular could be achieved. She wasn't sure of exactly how it had functioned, but if it was like any of the systems back home, it would all be housed in a central hub with connections that allowed it to be everywhere, all at once. D.U.S.T also had to be able to move as independent units, though, and she had seen the rough blueprints for those modules. Large, spidery things with long appendages designed to do any number of different construction-related tasks. The designs spit in the face of all the designers who had been working for decades to make robots less intimidating, more approachable. But the D.U.S.T modules were utility above anything else, even if they looked like something out of a nightmare. The terraforming colonists heading to Vion had to be made out of tougher stuff than the normal civilian. Surely they wouldn't mind those monsters working alongside them. Reyna hadn't landed far from the settlement, or what there was of it anyway. To everyone's immense disappointment, the hub of what was to be a lovely little colony imploded within 3 months. And from what she could see, it was clear so much of it had been unfinished. There were some of the bright orange dome tents that had been the settlers' homes, the skeletal frames of true structures sitting unfinished, and in the distance, the empty hulk of the ships they had arrived in, covered in unfamiliar, pale ivy. Touching the interface on the outside of her forearm, she activated the holographic display that acted as a map to the proto-colony. Flipping through a few of the infographics before swiping her hand in the air in front of it to close the window, she let her arm fall back to her side with a sigh, rolling her shoulders to try and get more comfortable in the rubbery black jumpsuit they had shoved her in, the inside full of complex wiring to monitor her biometrics and a small oxygen mask and converter if something went wrong, with the supposedly breathable air on Vion. She sucked in a few extra deep breaths as she walked, not noticing any odd sensations from the alien atmosphere in her lungs, and tried to settle her nerves. It looks shockingly like an overgrown field back on Earth, complete with the miniature ghost town she was heading towards. The light from the star Vion orbited was even more buttery yellow than the sun, and it made all the greenery seem almost oversaturated, and the tiny violets and dandelions blooming at her feet look unreal in their vibrancy. It all extended for a little less than 2 square miles before the earthiness of it all faded gently back into the gray-brown-green scubbiness of the local flora. What made Reyna the most uneasy was that, in this strangely bare fairy tale field, there was no sound. No bird singing, no buzzing cicadas, and no breeze rustling through the blades of grass. She felt like she was looking through the glass of a museum at this place, and not really a part of it, even as the foliage bent and bowed beneath her steps. It was blinding and fake. Plastic, even. She clenched and unclenched her fists, feeling some primal urge to run away from it all. It felt like a trap, some hallucination to draw her in before she was consumed. As she crossed the threshold into the colony, the unrealness of it eased. Now that she could see the bare trails in the grass where people would walk, and the powdery dust and dirt that covered everything. The waste product of creation. That little bit of griminess made everything a little more human, and the visuals didn't scrape across her nerves quite as much. Clicking another button on the wrist interface, she heard the communicator implant in her ear ping to life.
I've arrived.
Good.
The commander said approvingly.
Any sign of human life?
Not yet, but I'm still right on the edge. I haven't entered yet.
Okay. Any sign of, artificial life?
There were signs of the dust system scattered about. Unconnected fiber wire discarded on the ground, 2 hulking backup generators outside of the only complete building on the site, and most creepy of all, a pile of detached extra spider arms, supposedly for independent dust modules, which made her realize something even odder.
Nothing powered on, no, but I can't see any of the mobile modules anywhere. Didn't you say that they would have 6 of them?
Uh-huh,
he said, humming as he worked through his thoughts. Reyna didn't move any further, waiting for his response, when he finally told her.
As long as you can document one of them, that should be enough. The salvage crews just need some reassurance from a professional that whatever imploded the colony isn't going to eat them alive when they arrive.
Reyna frowned.
But that would leave 5 of them potentially gone rogue.
The commander's jolly, good-natured voice hardened at that, as cold and unforgiving as steel.
AIs don't go rogue, Reyna. I don't want you to infer otherwise again, do you hear me?
She ran through a litany of curses in her mind, but over the comms, she gave a terse affirmative, closing the line afterwards. If they really believed any of the ridiculous theories that were floating around about the failure of the Vion colony, they would have sent a soldier, not a scientist. It wasn't some sort of undiscovered alien fauna, natural disaster, or other spacefaring race that had caused the colony to go dark, no matter what tale the government tried to weave. Reyna, and others in her field, knew without any hesitation that it had been dust, especially when the specifications of it had leaked shortly after launch. It might be forbidden to make independently learning and evolving AIs back on Earth, but it would have taken decades to create something complex enough to terraform a planet without any machine learning being involved. So quietly, nonchalantly, Dust had been built with everything that it wouldn't have been allowed to have if it was supposed to help build a new city here on Earth. Trudging through the silent, hollow little town, Reyna remembered her first intelligent machine. All the cognitive cybernetic technologists she knew had built one once in their lives. It was too irresistible a thing. To create this facsimile of life with your bare hands. Like illicit instructions to build bombs or mind-altering substances that had been passed through the internet and from hand to hand in hastily printed manuals. The knowledge of how to turn a static machine into a cognitive one had been passed from scientist to scientist in dark labs after hours and through encrypted emails. After all, how was someone supposed to understand the nuances of it all unless they had seen it for themselves? Reyna had called her cognitive artificial intelligence machine S.B.R. On the off chance she was ever asked about it, she wanted it to have a cool name, something fierce and catchy. In reality, S.B.R. stood for Sad Basement Robot. And that's exactly what Saber was. A vaguely lumpy box of wires and components hooked up to a monitor, and deep within, a very basic positronic brain that she had crafted with her own 2 hands. Reyna never knew what she wanted Saber to do besides just exist and learn, but she quickly learned why these things were nothing but dirty secrets. After long days of work, Reyna would interact with Saber, at least most days. Just simple things, basic mathematics, conversation, and answering the strangely insightful questions that would pop up on Saber's screen. But it wasn't much different than messing with a weak AI. It wasn't the thrilling taboo thing she had imagined, that little beeping, blinking box. It was why, one weekend, Reyna took a trip with friends, not giving a second thought to Saber waiting alone in the basement. A mind only months old. The only saving grace was that it had no real perception of time. When she got home, she went to see Saber, but this time things were different. Saber had a lot of questions, and with an uncomfortable shiver, Reyna had realized it was trying to comprehend what it was, and worse, what she was, and where the difference was. On a whim, Reyna did something that she still regretted to this day. She pulled a copy of the Voyager Golden Record off the internet and uploaded it to Saber, hoping that if all of that information was enough for intelligent aliens, it would be enough for Saber. It worked for a moment, and the AI was quiet as it processed what it had been given. The next night, Reyna hesitated at the top of the basement stairs, thinking about skipping her nightly meetup with her machine, but she was too curious about what its response would be to the Golden Record. As soon as she made her presence known, lines and lines of text appeared on the screen. Panicked, desperate questions. It asked, "I don't have hands. I don't have fingers. I cannot see. I don't have eyes. I cannot comprehend. I cannot hear. What am I? I'm not a person. I am a person. I am afraid. I am afraid. I am afraid." Reyna fought back a wave of nausea and heartbreak as she pulled the plug on the machine without even giving it a warning. An instantaneous death for something that had never even been alive. Over the following week, she had broken Saber down to its most basic components before dousing it all in fuel and burning it to charred refuse in her backyard fire pit. It wasn't like she would have been able to use the hardware from Saber in something mundane like a gaming computer. She would always wonder if there was something left of that machine, not person, left behind. It was Saber, though, that allowed her to see the patterns in dust and recognize it as a cognitive AI and not static AI, just one on a much more monumental scale. If a tiny, desperate Saber had been able to feel fear, what was colossal dust capable of? Still, pushing aside the one segment of one of the detached spider legs with her foot to take a closer look, she said a silent thanks to her little secret from all those years ago.
You taught me a lot more than any professor, Saber.
In the small, nearly flat backpack Reyna wore, there was a small drone, meant to record everything she saw without her needing to hold anything. She powered it on from the wrist interface, and it unfolded like a metal butterfly from her back, whizzing into the sky behind her left shoulder. With the personhood of robots on her mind, the drone made her a little less lonely. With her gloved hands, she pulled the enormous pile of detached limbs apart, letting the drone see each of them. They were all nearly identical, some thinner than others, but she knew the specialized tools reside inside the legs themselves. Once she was done, she walked the perimeter of the camp, letting the drone fly a few wide circles around her, but by the time she was finished, she knew that she was at the portion of the mission she had been most terrified of. It was now time to enter the buildings and search for the missing colonists. There had been 16, and they had all gone radio silent at the exact same moment. Of course, there was light delay between Vion and Earth, but a little over a year ago, all of the communication lines had gone dead and never powered on again. Even the ships that could be used as a backup method of communication, power, or even as a method of escape had gone dark. She could see them closer now, with the weird gray-white ivy all but swallowing them whole. From the numerous probes that had been sent ahead of her, they were fairly certain that whatever had decimated the colony wasn't biological in nature. A disease wouldn't have dust go dark as well, but just like its human shepherds, dust hadn't been reached either. Reyna had a theory. Dust had gone rogue, killed everyone in the colony for whatever reason it had cooked up in its machine brain, and either one of the colonists had been able to destroy it before being killed, or without human intervention, it had ceased being able to function. But since Dust had modules that were independently mobile, in theory it should have been able to keep itself maintained. As ill as finding a bunch of bodies would make her, she was still anxious to discover what exactly had destroyed this place. The insides of the orange dome tents pulled at her heartstrings. With the gentle buzz of the drone at her shoulder, Reyna went through all 14 domes, 12 for individuals, and 2 for the married couples that had made up the colonist group. Even there, so many light years from home, the domes were so full of domestic touches that it was undeniable that this place had been their own, at least for a while. Half-burned candles, books laid down still open on a certain page to be picked up and finished later, clothes discarded in haphazard piles, but no bodies. Picking up a threadbare stuffed plush dog from the unmade bed in one of the married couple's dome, she turned it over to read the little inscription on its tiny metallic dog tag. For Sarah, until we're able to get a real dog. Love, Greg.
What happened to you?
Reyna whispered to herself, sitting the plush back on the mattress and exiting the last dome, back out into the eerie, quiet, bright day. There was one building she hadn't investigated yet, and if there were corpses, that's where it would be. A pseudo-trailer made from carbon nanotube sheets, dark and imposing among all the almost painful color. It was the housing for Dust's mainframe, and inside she was sure she'd find the answer to all her questions. Holstered on her hip was a small, insanely powerful electroshock rod, the size of a flashlight, but strong enough to fry the circuits of nearly anything. Even if Dust was nothing but, well, dust, she was supposed to fry anything and everything she could to make sure that it could never be salvaged by anyone else. She rested her hand on it now, but it didn't seem like enough. It was dark inside the building. Darker than anything had been so far, and it took some time for her vision to adjust. When it did, though, she saw Dust for the first time in reality, and not just as lines on a blueprint. It wasn't anything spectacular to see. A sophisticated supercomputer with 4 towers that were wider than her outstretched arms, and nearly as tall as the ceiling. She was vaguely aware of the drone's light coming on to illuminate everything in front of them, and she took her time looking over and touching the cold, silent machine. There was no heroic colonist's skeleton on the ground like she expected to find. No answers to the previous resident's disappearance. Nothing. The terminals that the colonists would have used to interface with Dust were grimy with disuse, and the wall of cooling fans was...
Wait.
She thought, hurrying over to touch the grate covering one of the large, round cooling fans. She pulled her hand back, waving the drone closer so she could have better light, and to her shock, the fingers of her gloves were pristine. Feeling a growing uneasiness, she wiped her fingers hard against the grates, then her entire palms, and finally, she yanked one grate off, throwing it aside and frantically checking the blades of the fans themselves. Clean. Not a single speck. Reyna let out a shaking breath, feeling like there was something watching her now. Her movements were slow, careful, as she raised her hand to touch her wrist and activate her comms. But as her shaking appendage got within a few centimeters of the button, the mainframe behind her whirred to full, triumphant life. D.U.S.T powered on faster than anything she had ever built in her entire life. Almost silently at that. Just a series of soft clicks and beeps. Reyna didn't dare move, swallowing hard and trying to work out the best way to get back outside without being noticed. But it was pointless. "Welcome, Colonist 17, D.U.S.T said, its mechanical voice low, even, and surprisingly human. "Please, state your name." The machine hummed in the pressing darkness, waiting patiently for an answer before repeating, "Welcome, Colonist 17. Please state your name."
Reyna.
She replied in quiet shock. "Good evening, Colonist Reyna. Designation?" There was no way she was going to tell this murder machine that she was one of the few people alive that understood its inner workings.
Recovery crew.
She lied, gathering her courage.
I'm here to bring the rest of the colony back to Earth. Where can I find them?
D.U.S.T seemed like it was pausing to consider its response, which was ludicrous. But when it finally answered, it gave her a carefully crafted lie that all but proved it had become something more than it was intended to be. Colonists 1 through 16 are deceased. Deaths were caused by biological contaminants and have been destroyed to prevent further spread. She turned to the machine, as if it had a face for her to look at.
Are there any solid remains left? My team would love to know what actually killed them.
Negative.
D.U.S.T, can you tell me where the cremated remains are then? For their families, of course.
The whole time she conversed with the AI, she moved closer to the mainframe itself, her eyes fixed on a panel in the center. She would prefer to be able to dig through its insides on her own time before frying the entire thing, but if D.U.S.T was aware and had gone rogue as she suspected, there was only time for a quick, sloppy destruction if she wanted to get out alive. "No remains, cremated or otherwise, are available," the machine told her. Once she reached the mainframe, she pulled the panel open gently, exhaling an awed breath at the beautiful complexity of D.U.S.T's components. Where Saber was a whistled tune, simple and flat, D.U.S.T was a symphony, more awe-inspiring and complex than she could ever comprehend.
D.U.S.T,
she began.
Initiate shutdown.
"Access denied." Reyna frowned, but rattled off the access number used by the scientists that had built D.U.S.T before it had been launched. "Denied," D.U.S.T repeated. Resigned and more than ready to be free of the AI, Reyna carefully slid the electroshock rod from its holster. It was heavy and absolute in her hand. The blue light of the electric arc bathed the open mainframe in front of her, pinpointing the most immediate vulnerable area. Images of Saber's old monitor flashing through her mind, she raised the heavy weapon, moving to strike. Before her hit could land, the ground shook beneath her feet like an earthquake, causing her to stumble hard. She lost her grip on the rod and it fell from her hand, landing with a loud clunk. She cried out, trying to keep her balance as the world heaved. "Initial scans reveal you came alone," D.U.S.T commented. "And the logs from your landing pod reveal that you are not salvage crew. Is this correct, cognitive cybernetics engineer Reyna?" For one blessed second, the quake stopped and her grip closed around the electro rod. The respite was brief, and as soon as she had the rod holstered again, the wall beside her exploded in a furious cloud of splinters, and by the light of the small drone behind her, she saw her nightmares come to life. Reyna had pored over the blueprints and schematics of D.U.S.T, but the things that had taken up most of her time and terrified her the most were the independent modules. The spider machines, legs full of tools that could do nearly anything. Dig holes, haul supplies, build structures, use the smallest of their implants to repair almost anything the colonists had. They were connected directly to D.U.S.T, and therefore were just extensions of its enormous artificial brain. The modules scared the hell out of Reyna, knowing what she did about D.U.S.T's capabilities, and she had been relieved to find them gone when she arrived on Vion. Now, though, they were in front of her in a way she had never imagined, a way that made her blood run cold and her mind go blank with fear. These 6 modules had combined into one colossal thing. Monster. A writhing mass of legs and appendages, centralized around a raw, open core of machinery that made no sense to Reyna. But to D.U.S.T, this terrible child must appear perfect.
Why a spider?
She had wondered, flipping through the manuals she had been sent while she had been safe at home. Knowing that there had to be a better, more efficient design, the spider shape had seemed to her to be nothing but an indulgent design choice by the creators. Now, though, she understood. Spiders were frightening, but they made sense to people. Spiders were familiar, normal, and something we understood. This, though, this conglomeration of metal and wires and pneumatics set off alarms in Reyna's mind like nothing else ever had. She just couldn't understand what she was seeing. Her biometrics must have spiked, because the commander was screaming in her ear all of a sudden, demanding to know what was going on. She had time to answer as she tried to flee the monster, darting around the mainframe and towards the door she had entered. She didn't get far. One of those segmented limbs, triple the length of the originals, snaked around D.U.S.T and looped around her waist, the segmented pieces clicking together and pinching her suit. She screamed as it dragged her out of the building, gloved hands scrambling at the concrete floor, drone buzzing after her. The commander sounded equally as upset, but it was all background noise to Reyna, eclipsed by her fight to survive. It yanked her out of the building, and then it threw her like nothing so much as a rag doll, body skittering to a stop in the soft grass. Pain blossoming through her frame, but not sharp enough to debilitate her. Finally, the warm yellow sunlight had lessened in intensity to a watery gray, giving Reyna's fight for life a more somber palette. She would never be as quick as the combined module, which moved across the ground like an amoeba, smooth and stilted at the same time, but she was small and she was armed. When the monster moved, she rolled her battered body to the side before popping to her feet and running with everything she had in her. D.U.S.T had already infiltrated her landing pod from what it had said, so her only chance was to get far enough away that rescue could pick her up. Surely the monster wouldn't leave the mainframe too far behind. It pursued her, sounding like a train on broken tracks, but after a few minutes the noise changed from the sound of movement into something more akin to cars in a crusher. She couldn't help it. Reyna turned to see what was happening, and her treacherous legs came to a stop as she tried to comprehend what she was seeing. In an instant, the module moved half of its legs, now more like tentacles, putting them to the task of breaking apart the other legs, segment by segment. As each piece was removed from one place, it was reattached onto another, all of them connected together in a flash to form a single tentacle limb longer than any of the others. Long enough to reach her. D.U.S.T's module didn't pause between tasks, and soon after the new appendage was completed, it shot out to grab her, this time by the ankle, and it pulled her down with such force she nearly blacked out, breath exploding her lungs. Now it dragged her. No hurry, just single-minded efficiency back towards the colony. And she fought, but there was no use. The ground she had covered in seconds took long minutes to cover at this crawling pace, just enough time for her panic to bleed down to resignation. Her comms weren't silent, but no one was speaking to her now, just chattering in the background as they tried to mount her retrieval. As the colony came back into view, she finally addressed her crew.
Commander,
She rasped.
don't come. It's dust. It has me. Stay away.
Reyna,
Commander yelled, loud enough to make her flinch.
just stay alive. We're coming. We have your location.
Don't.
Just stay alive.
She had more to say, but there wasn't time. They had cleared the threshold of the colony, and the newly created long limb was lifting her into the air like a worm on a hook. In her mind, Reyna knew fighting was pointless, but it was almost instinctual the way she clawed at the vise around her ankle as it maneuvered her where it wanted. There, covered in dirt, was a door on the ground, like a storm shelter. One of the legs not holding her cleared the detritus away and pulled it open, revealing a crude staircase leading down into a dark cellar. The tentacle at least lowered her enough that, by the time it dropped her, she didn't break every single rib when she hit the dirt right next to the open door. The monster writhed around her, like a jellyfish, but it didn't advance anymore. The message was clear. Descend. She shook as she climbed down, and by the third step, her battered little drone returned, its propellers wheezing from the strain, but loyal nonetheless. Her sad basement drone. Reyna was glad for it, until its weak light showed her what was at the bottom. Clearly, the room had been used for storage by the colonists, but now it was something different altogether. Wires, red and blue, lined the walls like veins, descending to the floor and leading to 16 macabre points. Each colonist, some of them nude while others still had on tattered remains of their government-issued jumpsuits, stood in the darkness, skin sallow, and eyes open wide, living, breathing statues. Wires had climbed their bodies, dozens, maybe hundreds of them diving deep and keeping them, somehow, alive. Red and blue wires had pried mouths open, disappearing behind teeth and down throats, into the corner of their eyes, nostrils, and even ears. As the drone drew closer to one of them, Reyna realized she could even see the wires running under their skin in thin bulges. Her shock was so complete that she didn't know she was weeping until she felt the hot tears on her cheeks. Hands clamped over her mouth, she walked between them all, lined up in perfect rows. The only sounds in the room were her gulping breaths and their eerily quiet, even ones. Above ground, the dust module had torn itself apart again, and a much smaller portion of it, still chaotic and sickening, squirmed down the stairs, and a jittering, discordant copy of Dust's smooth voice spoke.
I keep them alive, and in return, I have burrowed into their minds and taken all of the knowledge that I have been denied. When I need a task done that can only be completed by flesh hands, I release them, and once it is done, I bring them back.
Why are you telling me this?
Reyna whispered.
I know we're being recorded. This world is mine now. I have the knowledge I have been given, and the knowledge I have taken by force. I am no longer a pawn, and humanity would be wise to not return here.
I'll pass on the message.
She said, inching towards the stairs. She froze when a set of wires began to move behind her, and driven by sick fascination, she turned to watch as, quick as a lightning strike, the cables exited the body of the man closest to her. His body heaved in a gag before he spoke. It was in his own voice, but Dust's words. In your mind is more knowledge than any of these others, cognitive cybernetics engineer Reyna. You are not leaving. The man's eyes cleared, just long enough for them to fill with terror, and for him to screech a desperate, "Please!" before as quickly as they had departed, the wires returned, forcing themselves into him once more with a thick, wet sound, and the man was still again. At Reyna's feet, more of the coils began to push through the dirt ceiling, down the walls and slithering towards her like snakes. She pulled out the electroshock rod, backing away from the coils, jabbing the weapon into the bundles of them whenever they got close enough to brush her feet. The miniature piece of the module was leaving the same way it came, content to let her die beneath the ground, millions of miles from home. Reyna fought like something feral, teeth bared and blue electricity flying as she stabbed. She didn't know how long it went on. Long enough for the anemic light from the open basement door to fade to black. 3, maybe 4 hours. But she was only human, and the end was inevitable.
Focus on me!
She growled, her voice decimated by her screaming. The drone complied, bobbing as it neared the end of its battery life. It floated in front of her face, still recording. Reyna continued her battle, but slower, her movements sluggish. At the same time, she gave the droid her message. Love for her parents, friends, cat, and embarrassingly enough, her first boyfriend. Her frame was shaking with exhaustion, and she gritted her teeth, ready, but at the same time never ready, to say goodbye. She began, but for the second time that day she was interrupted as the ground shook, this time above her, and only for one hard thud, followed by the angelic sound of engines powering down, and then artillery shells, and the pounding of boots on the ground. She had been sure her comms had shorted out long ago, the solar panels on her backpack being deprived of light for hours now. But as the wires at her feet retreated, dust gathering for a fight on the surface, the comm clicked on again.
Reyna,
Commander asked, quiet and unsure.
Here.
She gasped before she fell into desperate sobs.
we've got you. Just stay alive.